the truth was most too much for her and no mistake, because Luella presently actually did faint away, and there wasn't any sham about it, the way I always suspected there was about them hysterics. She fainted dead away, and we had to lay her flat on the floor, and the doctor he came running out, and he said something about a weak heart, dreadful fierce to Mrs. Sam Miller, but she wasn't a mite scared. She faced him just as white as even Luella was, layin' there looking like death, and the doctor feeling of her pulse. "Weak heart," says she. "Weak heart, weak fiddlesticks. There ain't nothing weak about that woman. She's got strength enough to hang on to other folks till she kills 'em. Weak! It was my poor mother that was weak. This woman killed her as sure as if she had taken a knife to her." But the doctor, he didn't pay much attention. He was bending over Luella, layin' there with her yellow hair all streamin' and her pretty pink and white face all pale, and her blue eyes like stars gone out, and he was holding on to her hand and smoothing her forehead, and telling me to get the brandy in Aunt Abby's room. And I was sure as I wanted to be that Luella had got somebody else to hang on to, now Aunt Abby was gone, and I thought of poor Erastus Miller, and I sort of pitied the poor young doctor, led away by a pretty face, and I made up my mind I'd see what I could do. I waited till Aunt Abby had been dead and buried about a month, and the doctor was going to see Luella steady, and folks were beginning to talk. Then one evening, when I knew the doctor had been called out of town and wouldn't be round, I went over to Luella's. I found her all dressed up in a blue muslin with white polka dots on it, and her hair curled just as pretty, and there wasn't a young girl in the place could compare with her. There was something about Luella Miller seemed to draw the heart right out of you, but she didn't draw it out of me. She was settin' rocking in the chair by her sittin'-room window, and Maria Brown had gone home. Maria Brown had been in to help her, or rather to do the work, for Luella wa'n't helped when she didn't do anything. Maria Brown was real capable, and she didn't have any ties, she wa'n't married and lived alone, so she'd offered. I couldn't see why she should do the work any more than Luella. She wa'n't any too strong, but she seemed to think she could, and Luella seemed to think so too, so she went over and did all the work, washed and ironed and baked, while Luella sat and rocked. Maria didn't live long afterward. She began to fade away just the same fashion as the others had. Well, she was warned, but she acted real mad when folks said anything, said Luella was a poor abused woman, too delicate to help herself, and they'd ought to be ashamed, and if she died helping them that couldn't help themselves, she would. And she did. "I s'pose Maria has gone home," says I to Luella, when I had gone in and sat down opposite her. "Yes, Maria went half an hour ago, after she had got supper and washed the dishes," says Luella in her pretty way. "I suppose she has got a lot of work to do in her own house to-night," says I, kind of bitter. But that was all thrown away on Luella Miller. It seemed to her right that other folks that wa'n't any better able than she was herself should wait on her, and she couldn't get it through her head that anybody should think it wa'n't right. "Yes," says Luella, real sweet and pretty. "Yes, she said she had to do her washing to-night. She has let it go for a fortnight along of coming over here." "Why don't she stay home and do her washing, instead of coming over here and doing your work, when you are just as well able, and enough sight more so, than she is to do it?" says I. Then Luella she looked at me like a baby who has a rattle shook at it. She sort of laughed as innocent as you please. "Oh, I can't do the work myself, Miss Anderson," says she. "I never did. Maria has to do it." Then I spoke out. "Has to do it," says I. "Has to do it. She don't have to do it either. Maria Brown has her own home and enough to live on. She ain't beholden to you to come over here and slave for you and kill herself." Luella she just sat and stared at me for all the world like a doll baby that was so abused that it was coming to life. "Yes," says I, "she's killin' herself. She's gonna die just the way Erastus did, and Lily, and your Aunt Abby. You're killin' her just as you did them. I dunno what there is about you, but you seem to bring a curse," says I. You kill everybody that is fool enough to care anything about you and do for you." She stared at me, and she was pretty pale. "And Maria ain't the only one you're going to kill," says I. "You're going to kill Dr. Malcolm before you're done with him." Then a red colour came flamin' all over her face. "I ain't going to kill him either," says she, and she begun to cry. "Yes, you be," says I. Then I spoke as I had never spoke before. You see, I felt it on account of Erastus. I told her that she hadn't any business to think of another man after she'd been married to one that had died for her, that she was a dreadful woman, and she was, that's true enough, but sometimes I have wondered lately if she knew it, if she wa'n't like a baby with scissors in its hand, cutting everybody without knowing what it was doing. Luella, she kept getting paler and paler, and she never took her eyes off my face. There was something awful about the way she looked at me and never spoke one word. After a while I quit talking and I went home. I watched that night, but her lamp went out before 9 o'clock, and when Dr. Malcolm came driving past and sort of slowed up, he see there wasn't any light and he drove along. I saw her sort of shy out of meeting the next Sunday, too, so he shouldn't go home with her, and I began to think maybe she did have some conscience after all. It was only a week after that Maria Brown died, sort of sudden at the last, though everybody had seen it coming. Well, then there was a good deal of feeling and pretty dark whispers. Folks said the days of witchcraft had come again, and they were pretty shy of Luella. She acted sort of offish to the doctor, and he didn't go there, and there wasn't anybody to do anything for her. I don't know how she did get along. I wouldn't go in there and offer to help her. Not because I was afraid of dying like the rest, but I thought she was just as well able to do her own work as I was to do it for her, and I thought it was about time she did it, and stopped killing other folks. But it wasn't very long before folks began to say that Luella herself was going into a decline just the way her husband, and Lily, and Aunt Abby, and the others had, and I saw myself that she looked pretty bad. I used to see her going past from the store with a bundle as if she could hardly crawl. But I remembered how Erastus used to wait and tend when he couldn't hardly put one foot before the other, and I didn't go out to help her. But at last one afternoon I saw the doctor come driving up like mad with his medicine chest, and Mrs. Babbitt came in after supper and said that Luella was real sick. "I'd offer to go in and nurse her," says she, "but I've got my children to consider, and maybe it ain't true what they say, but it's queer how many folks that have done for her have died." I didn't say anything, but I considered how she had been Erastus's wife and how he had set his eyes by her, and I made up my mind to go in the next morning, unless she was better, and see what I could do. But the next morning I see her at the window, and pretty soon she came stepping out as spry as you please, and a little while afterward Mrs. Babbitt came in and told me that the doctor had got a girl from out of town, a Sarah Jones, to come there, and she said she was pretty sure that the doctor was going to marry Luella. I saw him kiss her in the door that night myself, and I knew it was true. The woman came that afternoon, and the way she flew around was a caution. I don't believe Luella had swept since Maria died. She swept and dusted and washed and ironed, wet clothes and dusters, and carpets were flying over there all day, and every time Luella set her foot out when the doctor wasn't there, there was that Sarah Jones helping of her up and down the steps as if she hadn't learned to walk. Well, everybody knew that Luella and the doctor were going to be married, but it wasn't long before they began to talk about his looking so poorly, just as they had about the others, and they talked about Sarah Jones too. Well, the doctor did die, and he wanted to be married first, so as to leave what little he had to Luella, but he died before the minister could get there, and Sarah Jones died a week afterward. Well, that wound up everything for Luella Miller. Not another soul in the whole town would lift a finger for her. There got to be a sort of panic. Then she began to droop in good earnest. She used to have to go to the store herself, for Mrs. Babbitt was afraid to let Tommy go for her, and I've seen her going past and stopping every 2 or 3 steps to rest. Well, I stood it as long as I could, but one day I see her